What I'm trying to do is come with a step back and say, well, this is what happened in the financial sector, but it happened in the most sophisticated economy in the world. And it hasn't happened, at least to this magnitude, since the Great Depression. Why did it happen here? Why now? Why did it happen in subprime loans, for example? Why did it start there? What was the cause? So this is trying to take a broader view of the forces that led to the crisis, the forces outside the financial sector, and that's why I call it fault lines, the stresses created by, say, the political environment, by the international macroeconomic environment, all of which sort of circle the financial sector and create the potential for the earthquake that happened. In fact, when you look at the details of what happened, you find that many people within the banks understood fully well what was going on, and yet they went along. And so my sense is you've got to move from just plain irrationality to argue that there were lots of people who are being perfectly rational given the incentives they faced. And what I document in the book is that these fault lines combine to create the kinds of incentives that feed into the already distorted incentives inside the banking system to take the whole system over the cliff. And we need to delve into greater detail to understand how that happened. But the whole point is that this wasn't a completely irrational thing. There was rational risk-taking. It was rational risk-taking because the price of taking risk had been distorted by all these processes outside the financial system, the push towards low-income housing, the extreme degree of stimulus given by the Fed, the willingness to intervene if the system got into trouble, and the flows coming in from outside, all of them combined essentially to give the financial system the incentive, which was primarily of the kind, if we bet and take more risk, we make tons of money. If we lose, somebody else will pick up the pieces. Well, the income inequality was one fault line which created the political pressure to send money in a particular direction. One of the things you notice when you look at developing countries is income inequality has pernicious effects. Often it restrains development, but often it also leads to the wrong kinds of policies. I think something similar happened in the United States. You had rising income inequality, and I'm not talking about income inequality at the very top, not John Paulson, the hedge fund manager making 75,000 times the average household wealth in 2008. People who have degrees are getting much higher incomes over time than people who have just a high school education, and people who don't have a high school education are being left behind at the bottom. Why is this happening? It's happening because first, jobs are becoming more demanding. They require more skills of people, but also it's happening because we seem to have reached a plateau in terms of education. The fraction of people graduating from high school hasn't improved since 1970. The fraction of males graduating from college has been stagnant over a long period of time. So this is a very worrisome trend because it's saying the supply of the educated is not keeping pace with the demand for the educated. And as a result, what is happening is income inequality is increasing. Now, why does this connect to the crisis? Well, I think that what happened in the 1980s and the 1990s was a sense that too many people were being left behind. And of course, the political process responds. Now, how do you help people whose incomes aren't growing? Well, you try and retrain them, you try and educate them, but that's really difficult, and it takes a long time. The next possible alternative was credit, and that's often the alternative found in developing countries. By giving people who are falling behind easy credit, you allow them to consume, and after all, consumption matters as much, if not more, than incomes. And if you also give them a housing credit, maybe they look at the house price, see it increase, feel themselves better off, are allowed to borrow against that house price to fund consumption. And the fact that the incomes are stagnating doesn't matter so much. I argue that housing credit and the push towards low-income housing credit was a palliative, a way to take people's attention off the deeper problem that incomes were stagnating, and it worked. Mm-hmm. It worked for the Republicans. It created more homeowners who typically tend to vote Republican. It worked for the Democrats. It created more flows towards their natural constituency. Both supported it in a big way. President Clinton through affordable housing initiatives, President Bush through what he called the Ownership Society, tons of money was poured into low-income lending by various quasi-government agencies and government agencies. And to my mind, that helped the process of creating what we've now got, which is an unholy mess in the housing sector. No doubt, great intentions, but the problem with government action is rarely that of intent. It is of unintended consequences. I argue in the book that the relatively short safety net in the United States, unemployment benefits expire after 6 months. Most people have healthcare benefits tied to jobs until the recent bill, and that's not going to kick in for another 4 or 5 years. So the real problem is that people who lose their jobs have tremendous amounts of anxiety because, coupled with the low savings, they really have nothing to fall back on. What's happened since 1991 is we've had what are called jobless recoveries. It took 23 months for the jobs lost in the recession to come back in 1991. It took 38 months, 3.25 years, for the jobs to come back in 2001. By most estimates, this current recession, it'll take longer than 3.25 years, maybe 5 years. Well, if you think about it that way, what's 6 months of unemployment benefits when you're looking at 5 years' worth of unemployment? When it's all about jobs, the kinds of policies that are undertaken can be extreme and may not have the intent if the corporations aren't hiring, but you're pushing very hard on every button that you have, fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus, job owning, everything you're doing. Sometimes that can go in the wrong direction. And what I argue is in 2002, 2003, 2004, the Fed was on hold, kept interest rates really, really low, because it was worried that jobs weren't coming back. That's why I argue maybe we ought to think about extending the safety net to something which makes more sense, given the nature of recoveries has changed, because that will allow for calmer, more sensible policies.